Hello all, welcome back to a course on digital accessibility, and as we are moving towards the last leg of the course, we would like to discuss a few aspects of accessibility which matter a lot in terms of how and why accessibility compliance becomes important, why it is part of universal rights, human rights and all of those aspects. So, we will today try to understand a little bit about policy, advocacy and the future of accessibility in particularly from the context of Indian context. So, let us try to understand first that why policy matters, particularly in the case of accessibility. So, accessibility is not just a design issue, and it is actually a rights based issue. It is a human right to have access to information. It is a human right to have access to education. So, if somebody is unable to interact with or is unable to access employment, education or information due to the issues related to interaction design aspects, then it is not an institutional issue. It is the designer's problem to make sure that compliance is in place. So, policies and laws around accessibility have recently gathered a lot of attention, and it has taken shape in a very strong way, particularly in our country. And we have discussed some of the recent Supreme Court rulings, etc., in this domain, which have shaped the policies. And we also have now from the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment and from even the Constitution itself that it is part of the human right to life, which is your first basic human right. So, what do policies do? They institutionalize inclusion. So, it is again not just an architect's problem, or it's not just a compliance problem, but it is everyone's responsibility to ensure inclusion, and it is also the responsibility of the person getting excluded to demand inclusion. Right. So, once the policies are institutionalized in the system, the users can also be aware as well as empowered to use their and exercise their right to inclusion. And without policy, we have already seen that without the law, without the policy, accessibility mostly remains an option for organizations, for designers, for developers, and even for the users themselves. They don't feel empowered to demand inclusion, right? They don't feel that it is part of their right to have access to all of this information, employment, education. So, it remains optional. So, this is why policy really matters in accessibility. So, as we spoke about that, accessibility has now been recognized as a human right, and the right to life, which is part of our constitution, is also encompasses access. So, it also enables equal participation in the digital society. It the legal recognition strengthens accountability also. So, any policy is passed as a policy or a law or an amendment, it's also recognizing and standing accountable for the people of the country as well as for the organizations a higher sense of accountability when it comes to digital access is brought into place through policy. Enables access to education, employment, services, everything. It moves accessibility from charity, an act of charity, to rights. So, some of the aspects which kind of come under the umbrella of accessibility policy can be your formal rules, laws, or guidelines. Like, for example, we have spoken earlier about the BIS standards, or we have spoken in depth about the RPWD Act. And then there can be other set of rules which can be institution based, it can be academia based, it can be employment related, etc. Then there can be mandates to enable accessible design and services. So, for example, we have discussed in depth about the requirement for third party accessibility audits, right. So, for example, it is mandatory to get it done. If you are not doing it, then you can be penalized by law. Then similarly, applicable to both public and private sectors is the most important thing, so that no sector is kind of putting that part of the accountability on the other. Then there are reinforcement, the laws. Once you make the laws, once you make the policies, the government have made and framed the policies as well as the guidelines, but then there are also enforcement mechanisms. So, for example, there is a commissioner of inclusion, and commissioner is supposed to enforce these laws. They're supposed to, they can penalize organization, they can ask them to get audit done, a third party audit done for their products, etc. They can be the first point of contact for grievances and pleas against bigger organizations whose product may not be following accessibility guidelines, etc. Now, let us talk about what globally the policy around accessibility stands. I think this is again has been established that throughout the world, policy around accessibility in major countries, it is a rights based framework worldwide. Accessibility and inclusion is considered a human right, and digital accessibility has been increasingly mandated around the world. Public sector compliance requirements. So, then again similar to India, most countries, the governments have mandated compliance. So, even in India, it is mandatory for all public sector portals or consumer facing products like apps and websites to be compliant with WCAG 2.2 guidelines, and it is mandatory for them to do it, otherwise they are reprimanded and penalized. Even from the private sector, there is a lot of growing accountability. Several reasons may be there. So, one is really enforcement of these laws. Then there are several lawsuits globally which we have discussed as case studies also, which have increased corporate accountability. Integration of accessibility into public procurement policies. So, it has also been seen globally that procurement policies are also now more open, they are more inclusive in their approach. And it is not just the infrastructural aspects, they are not just meant for people who are supposedly able to interact, but it is also mentioned in procurement policies that once you are, say for example, I want to build a class with 100 chairs, right. So, whether I would like to buy 100 chairs of all left side or all right handed lecture tables, or do I want say 5% of left handed lecture tables also. So all of these decision making which do affect inclusion in a classroom setting are now part of these procurement policies globally. Then expansion of mechanisms and penalties for non-compliance. So this is something again which has been recently seen globally, including India, that there has been a lot of proactive penalization for non-compliance for bigger organizations also. So let us now try to understand why policy is necessary. So voluntary compliance is sometimes inconsistent. So I would like to stop at some point and I would like to feel that okay, what I have done for access is enough. So to have that blanket benchmark policy is very necessary, and then to establish those benchmarks, particularly with compliance related aspects, or with decision making pertaining to how much is enough, right? So I think that is also that's why voluntary compliance is not something which is going to be very consistent across the board, but policy based or law based compliance, everyone will have to follow that blanket benchmark. Then market forces alone are insufficient. So we have discussed this in some of the sessions previously, that it may be not a very profitable aspect for organizations to invest in accessibility always. Depending on the scale and the size of their organization, they would choose to invest in accessibility and ensuring accessibility. But that is why we are saying that market forces, and even though there are almost 20% people with some or the other disabilities living globally, they are still considered a minority, and market forces are driven by majority players, unfortunately. So that is why policy is required to ensure inclusion of these 20%, rather than relying on the 80% to be good hearted. We are also relying on policy. Then policy, as we mentioned earlier, ensures minimum standards. It also protects marginalized or minority users. Let us move to some of the key elements of accessibility policy. So first is of course clear scope and applicability. The government and the organizations, the policy makers have to clearly define what comes under the umbrella of policy, XYZ policy, and people who are trying to comply with those policy also need to understand what is the scope of that policy, what is the scope of that law, and where all it is really applicable. Defined standards. So for example, the WCAG alignment, one of the major aspects of policy is first is scope, then it is your benchmarking, then there is monitoring and reporting mechanisms. So there has to be mechanisms in place where people who are feeling or getting excluded can report their situation. There has to be monitoring across the board, both from public and private sectors, and bodies which are able to monitor the compliance with standards or applicability of the policy. Then of course the enforcement or compliance pathways. So one is, of course, there are organizations, several of them, which are consulting individuals as well as organizations on compliance related aspects, and then there are also enforcement organizations which are ensuring that the compliance standards are met. So how we can move from policy to practice? So policies define the global or government expectations, but organizations implement those policies through process. And we have discussed throughout this course different ways of evaluation, different design principles, different design frameworks of how accessibility can be ensured at a design level, at a coding level, how we can keep evaluating during the development phase, how we can evaluate post launch, and what are the different mechanisms of ensuring accessibility. So this is what primarily was discussed during the course. Then there is training and internal governance required. So we have also discussed this in some part of it in the course, where organizations have to do internal training, and they might also have to do a little bit of internal governance, in the sense that they might have to do enforcement of their own internally, so in order to ensure adherence to policy. And then accessibility integrated into life cycle. So any product development, if the entire thought process, the entire development cycle has accessibility integrated in the ethos, in the mindset of the team, in the mindset, the spirit of the organization, it is very unlikely that it will result, the cycle will result in an inaccessible product. So all of these integration mechanisms also we have discussed in this course. So let us take a case example where accessibility policy was seen in action. So a national policy mandates WCAG compliance for all public websites. Then government portals undergo accessibility audits. Procurement contracts require accessibility compliance. Non-compliant services receive deadlines for remediation, right? So how a policy is transforming into action is something we are seeing here. Again, here how a policy is transforming into action. So systemic improvement in digital inclusion has happened with these policies, because the national policy mandated WCAG compliance for all public websites. So action was that the government portals had to undergo accessibility audits, and they had to redesign their websites accordingly. Then procurement contracts require accessibility compliance. This was another policy, and what happened was that non-compliant services automatically receive deadlines for remediation, else they will be penalized. So what is, let us all try to also understand, we are using these words interchangeably. So what is policy is like a mandatory requirement, right? Guideline is recommended frameworks. They can be mentioned as part of the policy, or it may not be mentioned as part of the policy. And then there can be best practices, which is your industry driven improvements, right? So all three have to work together in order to ensure inclusion at a systemic, at an institutional level, and in a sustained manner. to ensure that any new product which is being churned out from the organizations are accessible by its true nature and they are sustainably accessible. Now let us come to some of the barriers to policy implementations. All of these discussions, we are aware that policies are in place, compliance is required, people are trying their best to implement it, they are trying to follow the guidelines, etc. But then still there's not enough access, there's not enough inclusion. What might be the reason? What might be some of the barriers? First is definitely lack of awareness. So, lack of awareness is something which we are also trying to solve through this course. So, all of you who are enrolled in this course are now very well sensitized and aware about digital accessibility and why and how it is important to know about it, to learn about it, to implement it in your product development life cycle, and how to implement it, how to evaluate your products, all of that we have discussed. But the primary reason of this course is to make you aware, is to sensitize you about it. And so in turn you can also go to your organizations, you can talk to your colleagues, you can talk to your peers and make them aware about those digital accessibility and the fact that it is now mandated by law to ensure digital accessibility across the board. Another bigger barrier is budget constraints with a lot of organizations. It is one of the big problems, especially startups. We are seeing a lot of entrepreneurial energy in India currently, but they may not be able to, budget out, these accessibility related requirements. But we have shown with lots of examples that incorporating accessibility in the beginning, from the beginning of the thought process, innovation cycle, is always going to cost you lesser as compared to paying the price of falling out customers or compliance related lawsuits. It is always going to cost you more. So, despite the budget constraints, it is our recommendation that you please sensitize your company, your employees and your teams about accessibility and try to incorporate and budget out some of the evaluation tools at least, and get third party audits done for your proposed products. Limited technical expertise is also one of the major barriers to policy implementation, which again this course is trying to do. Is we are trying to build capacity for digital accessibility in young designers, in early career professionals, in mid-career professionals. Anybody who is not aware, who is not an expert on accessibility, can take a course like this and become a decently knowledgeable person about digital accessibility, and they can keep developing their expertise on evaluation, etc. Then in the industry there is this token compliance mindset, which is also a barrier because they don't look at the comprehensive picture, they don't look at the overall experience of the user, and in the sense of completing tokens, people lose vision of the whole big picture, and that is what we have seen in a lot of products, in a lot of examples throughout this course, that some team, some person who's part of sub team of a big team of the whole project overlooked a certain statement, a certain line in the code, which resulted in a big gap in access. So, it is very important to propagate a visionary mindset in your development teams, wherein they have a vision about the overall experience which encompasses usability, accessibility, all of these aspects in the product itself.